Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Meng's A-18F Super Hornet in 1/48 scale. I know a lot of people like the Hornet, so without any further ado, let's get on with this video. So then, naturally we are going to be starting off in the cockpit. Interestingly, there isn't a huge amount of assembly which takes place here. The control column and also the throttle has to be cemented in, but everything else is beautifully moulded in by Meng. Because of that quick assembly, we can already move our attentions onto the ejection seats. The seats themselves I think are broken up perfectly, consisting of only 5 parts each. I think Meng have managed to find a really good equilibrium between part count, but also a great level of detail. One small issue which I did encounter was the locating pin on the underside of the ejection seat being a little bit too big, so all I had to do was remove some excess material and then it fit perfectly. With general assembly somehow already finished on the cockpit, I can turn my attention to the wheelbase. The wheel wells offer an incredible amount of detail, some aspects of it being external parts which you have to fit, but also an incredible level of moulded in detail. Once the floor is all put together, a couple of sidewalls encapsulate all of that incredible detail. And finally, the main wheel wells are made up of 3 pieces. You have that floor piece and then 2 sidewalls. The level of detail for only 3 pieces is absolutely astonishing. I love how crisp and detailed all of those wires are. Now that a substantial amount of the sub-assemblies are assembled, we can move on to the first bit of painting. Everything was initially primed with Mist Surfacer 1500 black, and then I could go on to the main colours. The wheel wells received a generous coating of Mr. Colors C1 white, and the cockpit tub itself also received a coating of Mr. Colors C335 medium sea grey. Both of these colours were applied in a uniform coat, not attempting to achieve any sort of modulation at this stage. After an hour had passed, I could then whip out the hairy stick, also known as a paintbrush, and start to do some detail painting. I initially picked out the black of the control columns, and then I came in on top and started to pick out some dials and switches with some whites, greys and reds. Any black aspects of the cockpit received a dry brushing of buff oil brusher to highlight any of the details and make them look a little bit more interesting. Another area which required a little bit of extra attention would be the instrument panel. The instrument panel is beautifully detailed, however all those screens looked a little bit flat. So what I did was got some GX100 and dabbed it onto the screens to hopefully make them look a little bit more glassy. Now everything can start to come together. The pilots and their ejection seats can be slotted into the cockpit. My apologies for not covering this too much. I'm still working on my figure painting, as I wouldn't want to show you guys how I do something if I don't think it's up to standard. So hopefully in the near future we'll see some figure painting. So with the last aspects of the cockpit now being buttoned together, that kind of sums up a really enjoyable cockpit to build. I can now cement it on top of the nose landing gear bay with 2 really nice large locating pins. Now 2 halves of the nose section of the F-18 can encapsulate the cockpit and also the nose landing gear bay. It has some nice locating pins here, however the rear has a little bit of movement, so I take your time in this place. Turning attention to the top half of the fuselage now. Initially, this hinge is cemented into position. This dictates if you would like to have your wings in the folded position or extended. I'm personally going to be opting for the folded position. The intakes are broken up into two separate pieces. This is really good, however of course there is still a seam to sort out. For sorting out this seam I used some Vallejo plastic putty and that did the job great. After this has been sorted out, it can be cemented onto one of the main landing gear bays. You do this for each side and they slot together once again with nice locating tabs. Once both of the intakes have been assembled, they slot really nicely into the lower half of the fuselage. I found that dry fitting was my best friend here, as if you mess up the fitment here, you can cause an awful lot of issues at the rear portion of the F-18. So take your time, do a couple dry fits and you'll be grand. Once you're happy with the fitment, you can use these side portions to encapsulate the main landing gear bay and also the intake. These fit really well, however once again, do some dry fitment. One very important step before you close the fuselage up is fitting these polycaps. If you don't fit these polycaps, the horizontal stabilizers will have nothing to connect to, leaving them very droopy, so make sure you fit them. Once fitted, you can join the lower and top half of the fuselage together. Now we can use that nose section which we prepared earlier and just slot it into the corresponding gap on the front end of the Hornet. Now the Hornet is a very complicated shape to replicate in a scale model. Although Meng have done an absolutely brilliant job of trying to hide a lot of the seams, there are just some which are a bit too prominent. So some Mr. Dissolve putty and a couple of hours of sanding will do the trick. With all those pesky seams now sorted out, we can continue on with the build. Initially this backplate gets cemented in, followed by a rear portion of the spine clicking in behind that. The nose cone and also the gun port follow suit at the front of the aircraft. Now moving on to putting together the vertical stabilizers for the F-18. I think the vertical stabilizers on the Hornet are what make it so recognisable and make it such a menacing sort of shape. Once the rudder is cemented in position with its functioning hinge, the other half of the vertical stabilizer can encapsulate and sandwich it. The final bits of assembly which I didn't manage to film were the folding wingtips and also the flaps. Nothing to report here except for really good fitment. So for the canopy in this kit there is in fact a seam line which goes down the middle of it. These are pretty easy to tackle if you know what you're doing, so this is kind of how I do it. With my scalpel blade I level out the seam and then I start to sand it away. To do this I'm using Expo sanding sponges. These can be found down at Hannants London. Hannants London is my local model shop and it is where I get all of my kits and supplies. It is stacked with all you could ever dream of in terms of modelling. Planes, tanks, cars, ships, paints, you name it, it'll be down there. On top of this, it is next to the RAF museum, so why not make a day of it? Lastly, I make sure to work on my current project at the back of the shop, so if you want some pre-release content, you know where to find me. Anyway, after I had sanded out that seam and it was all level, I could use some Tamiya polishing compound to get rid of all those really fine scratches. And that was the process all completed. It left me with a really nice clear canopy. Now to completely finish up the cockpit, I'm going to be cementing in the anti-glare shield, and then the HUD, which sits on top of this, will be coated in the holographic film. The way that I've done this is I've traced out holographic film in the shape of the clear parts, and then just stuck them on using some GX100. After this is cured, I can then cement on that front canopy. The main canopy is tacked on using some PVA glue, and then I can use this ASK mask set to protect the glass. It fits perfectly and is nice and sticky. So that pretty much sums up the general build. As you can see, it doesn't take too long to put together, and it's a pretty darn big airframe. Now, Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black can be used to unify the airframe using the pressures in the top right. Now, I'm going to be using this furball set, which has loads of really interesting schemes. I really like the look of this low-vis diamond back scheme, but then I really wanted to do one of the E's as well. So when confronted with this awful problem, there was only one solution. And that solution was to, in fact, just buy an E and build an E. My mum always used to tell me, what's better than one Hornet? 2 Hornets. So there we go, guys. We're going to be doing 2 Hornets in this video. Lucky you. Right, so we have a lot of painting ahead of us now. So let's get started. So the first step was going to be to create some underlying texture to the paint. To do this, what I'm going to be using is this airbrush stencil that you can see on screen. What this helps me to do is to create lots of varying shapes, which will in fact hopefully show through on the final paint layer. It's good to try and use all aspects and all parts of the stencil so that you get a nice varied effect. Once this is done, I can start to use my top colour for the first time. And this is Mr. Colour's C307, which is dark ghost grey. What I'm doing with this colour is I've thinned it down, probably a bit more than I usually would, and I'm mottling it in between all of the panels. The main reason that I like to do this at this stage is once it's all been blended in, which you'll see in a moment, it gives quite a good representation of all the surface detail on the model, and then I can pick and choose what I would like to accentuate even more with post shading. Now that I've gone around the entire aircraft doing this mottling effect, I can once again use the dark ghost grey and uniformly blend everything in. Once I'm at a blending level which I'm happy with, I can now start the post shading process. For my workflow, I personally prefer to start off with the highlights. So what I've done is I've got the Mr. Colour C307 and I've added about 20% of white into that mix. What this has done is given me a lightened version of that dark ghost grey. With this colour and thinned with rapid thinner, I can get really close to the model and start to go around the edges of certain panels and start to highlight them. What this does is it really pronounces them and pops them out of the surface. In certain areas, I prefer to bring the airbrush back a little bit and have a bit of a softer gradient. I find this is a good option to use if you're trying to replicate a little bit more of a sun-bleached effect and change the general tone of an area. Here you can see I'm trying to highlight the rivets along the wings and just make them look a little bit more sun-bleached. This very subtle tonal change just draws the viewer's eye to these surface details, and that's all I'm trying to do here. And after a few hours of highlighting, this is what I landed on. I was really happy with how that grey was broken up. But we're definitely not done there. Now what we need to do is go the other extreme and do some dark shading. To do this, I'm going to use Mr. Colors C137 Tire Black. This is sprayed along a lot of the panel lines, and what I found this helps to do is balance out the colours. So the highlights definitely make the grey look a little bit too bleached, whereas putting some of this Tire Black onto it helps to bring everything back down. And here was the final result for the top. I was very pleased with how this came out. Now, turning my attention to the underside, I'm going to be using Mr. Colors C308, which is light ghost grey. This time I want to try and emulate this photo here. What this photo is demonstrating is the ground crew's efforts to repair the paint from salt weather corrosion. What this does is leaves loads of these blotchy appearances of really much lightened colours of paint, and it looks really abstract but really cool at the same time. So how I want to demonstrate this on the model is going to be to use a lightened version of Mr. Color C308 and spray it onto certain areas which I can see on references are that lightened colour. Now to create the shapes I need to mask them off. I found using Mr. Masking Fluid and also masking tape was the best way to replicate these sort of shapes. Now that I'm happy with all of the areas being masked off, I can use Mr. Color C317, which is that tire black colour, also mixed in with a little bit of dark earth. The dark earth gives the paint a slightly more dirty feel and just adds a little bit more contrast into the paint. I'm very careful when I'm spraying this not to go too heavy, as if I go too heavy the effects might be too overwhelming and it almost looks like an accident rather than an intended technique. I didn't just do this effect on the underside of the nose. After looking at reference images, it seems that on the wings they did this or had this sort of effect quite a lot, so I also replicated it there. So now that everything had been removed, this was the final result. I'd be intrigued to know what you think of this effect. Do you think it works on the airframe, or do you think this sort of style of weathering should potentially just be left for the real jets? Let me know what you think. Now all I had to do was all of that one more time, and that is 2 Hornets all painted up. I went for the E being slightly more weathered in terms of the modulation, and the F being slightly cleaner. I wanted a little bit of variation, as if I had 2 Hornets painted the exact same way in every aspect, it might look a little bit weird. However, that isn't all the painting done. I did have to spray the nose cone a slightly darker shade of grey, and also some of the metallic elements had to be sprayed as well. This included the gun port and also the rear section of the exhausts. Once that was done, everything received a generous coating of GX100 gloss. This provided me with a brilliant base for the decals to go down onto. I opted for going for the Royal Maces for the FA-18E and the Diamond Backs for the FA-18F. I think both these schemes are really cool, as I love low vis Hornets. But if you thought I should have done a high vis one, let me know down below. Now it's time to start doing some weathering. On screen you can see a lot of the products which I'm going to use, but we're going to be starting off with the Black Knight wash. Although it says Black Knight on the tin, it actually has a little bit more of a bluey tinge, and that is exactly what I wanted to complement the grey. It is applied straight out of the bottle and can be very gently wiped off once dry. After I'd got rid of as much excess as I wanted, this was the result. I was very happy at how well that managed to pick out all of the beautiful recessed details that Meng provides. Next up on my checklist is going to be increasing the soot, grease and grime around a couple of the access panels. To do this, I'm going to be using Starship Filth Oil Brusher. I like to dispense the oil into a little metal palette before applying it onto the model. Using a brush, I apply it onto a small region of panels which I'm going to start working on. I always find with oils it's better to start small and then go big, instead of put too much oil onto the model which you can't work with effectively. Once the model is onto the panels which I want to work off of, I can use a round flat-headed brush to start to very gently blend them in. If I blend it in a little bit too much, all I do is apply a little bit more oil and repeat the process. 10-15 minutes later and you can really see how that grime is starting to build up. I keep on continuing this process all throughout the airframe. And this is where I called it quits. I was really happy with how it was looking at this stage. I think this is one of my best weathering jobs I've done to date. Now I was conscious not to leave out any of the sub-assemblies as well. Here I am weathering out the horizontal stabilizers. Initially using Mr. Weathering Colour's ground brown wash, applying it straight from the bottle into the general area, and then using a sponge and actually sponge blending, yes that is the technical term which I'm going to call it, into the surface. If I'm being completely truthful, I have never done it like this before, but seemingly it kind of works. So just dab it and blend it in, and then I'm going to use a flat-headed brush to blend in any of the areas which are a little bit too jagged for my liking. Now onto one of my favourite bits of the weathering process, and that is putting streaks onto the wings and any of the other areas. What I do is use a black oil brusher this time and very gently start to create the general shape of a streak, and then using that flat round headed brush I blend in the very tips of it to make it disperse into the surroundings. And the final bit of weathering for this build is going to be to weather up the very pristine looking walkway decals. Initially using Abtoilan 502 faded white, it is applied and then wet blended into the surroundings, giving this salt bleached look. And there you go, so I just have to do that one more time and I have two Hornets looking like they are ready to rock and roll. I love how beaten these two look and I really think it's one of my most authentic weathering jobs. However, you guys are the best critics, so let me know. Now, moving my way back onto some sub-assemblies, which was quite a nice change up after doing so much painting and weathering. Initially, I'm going to be looking at sorting out the landing gear wheel wells, and if you are familiar with the F-18, you'll know that all of the wheel well doors have this red rim around them. To paint this, I'm going to be using the newly released AK paint markers to do this, and honestly, for this job, they were an absolute lifesaver. I got all of those gear doors done within 10 minutes. Everything can now start to be brought together. The front landing gear slots into position really securely with two locating pins, and honestly you probably wouldn't even need glue for this. There's a really nice snap fit. Once it is secured though using some super glue, I started to clip on all of the just painted landing gear doors. The same process took place for the main landing gear and the main landing gear wheel well doors. Now turning my attention to the wings, I can put the flaps on first. These two pins hold them in position, and also I'm using CA glue to ensure that they have a nice strong bond immediately. Now it was time for the part of the build which I'd been waiting so long for, and that was putting all of the weapons onto the Hornets. For the A-18F, I'm going to be using 3 drop tanks, 2 GBU-24s, 3 AIM-120s, and 2 AIM-9Xs. Really cool looking loadout. If you're interested on the F-A-18E, I'm going to be using 4 GBU-12s, 3 AIM-120s, 1 drop tank, and 2 AIM-9Xs. Flipping the aircraft over, the afterburners can now be pushed into position. The fitment is so good here that there was no need for any cement whatsoever. If you're interested in how I got that brown sort of metallic effect, check out my F-35 video as I do a full tutorial on how to paint them. Now onto more of the flight control surfaces. The vertical stabilizers friction fit into position as well. I was so impressed at how many of these parts didn't need any glue, and when you're doing the final assemblies, I'm sure you all know how much you'd appreciate not having to use glue. The horizontal stabilizers are the exact same story. The outer folded wingtips just slot and rest in position on that nice sturdy hinge. There is a cover piece which you have to push into position as well. Make sure you don't forget that, as I very nearly did. Now the final steps for this build is going to be removing the masking tape from the canopy, giving it a little bit of a dust off, and then placing it in position. Once that is done, that completes my Hornets. So thank you very much for watching this video. I really do hope that you've enjoyed it and you liked the little surprise with the other Hornet. Anyway, without any further ado, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time guys. Bye bye.